I bumped into this gentleman at a pub, and I only started speaking to him because he had a GT BMX out front and it looked beautifully restored. It was chrome perfection. His name's Kieran Power and he lives just around the corner from me. And we decided to talk about BMX, and it turns out we've got a lot in common.
Yeah.
The 80s was a pivotal time for cycling development in Australia, wasn't it really?
Very much so. Early 80s, you know, I mean, certainly it was obviously the very early days of BMX globally. Obviously I started riding in probably around 78 with a converted dragster, which a lot of people back then started. And then moved on very briefly in 79 to a Quicksilver, and then shortly after in 81 I moved on to a Redline Pro Line, and I rode that for a couple of years and then sort of finished racing at that point.
And we're going to talk today about a JMC,
Yep.
but then we might do a series, because you've got how many bikes in your stable?
We've got 4 here, I've got 1 build on the go, and I've got another 3 in storage away from here. I've got my 83 JMC Shadow, which for me as a kid, I remember racing against a couple of kids who had JMCs, and for me they were the holy grail. And I wasn't fortunate enough to have one back in the day, so since I've got a lot older, I've been fortunate enough to collect and build the bike I never managed to have.
That's probably the original bike that changed bike design,
Yeah.
because of the way that the seat tube pierced the top tube.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I do. You know, I mean, obviously with the JMC, you know, Jim Mellon was a bit of a he was known for leading that sort of frame geometry type thing, and I know certainly in the early 80s a lot of the frame geometry was quite and the makeup was quite aggressive for its day. I think today personally it's still, you know, I mean, I know these days the seats are slammed and everything, but I think today it's still a great looking bike, but maybe I'm biased. I think the geometry is great. I've got the Darryl Young forks on mine. Again, yeah, they're sort of the aero forks almost look like they've been squashed. Again, you know, it was the thing that I always was in awe back in the day about the JMCs, is that nobody else was doing those sort of aero forks. And I remember very, very distinctly seeing the first time I saw those on a track, and it was, you know, wow, you know, this guy's going to go fast because he happens to have aero forks, right? I build all of my bikes to ride. Although I'm probably a little bit, how can I say, a little bit of a snob when it comes to the whole reproduction versus original parts. I tend to build all of my bikes with original parts, but given that they're riders, the only things that I tend to put on them that are reproduction are the grips and the tyres. That's an original JMC seat post. That took me 18 months searching everywhere to get that. I'm sort of more of a, you know, I build all of my bikes where each part has some sort of, I guess, connection to me as a kid. I like the JMC decal on it. I think sort of putting a pad on it. Originally I had a plate on this too, but it sort of hid that. I love my Pro Neck stems, and I've got the Susie sealed hubs. They spin like butter. They're a great, I mean, I've got a couple of different hubs on these bikes, but these are by definitely the smoothest spinning sealed hubs, so they spin very, very smoothly. Yeah, so they're Bullseye 2nd gen cranks. I never actually had a set when going back in the day, but I always admired them. I knew a few people that had them. So when I was building the JMC, it was just something that I had to put on them. I had them floating around. I love them that much. I bought them without a bike in mind. I've been sitting in my shed there for best part of 2.5 years. This is an 83 frame, so the Bullseye 2nd gens are period correct. And of course the best thing about it, it's a Euro bottom bracket. I mean, that's the other thing that attracts me about this particular JMC Shadow. Not the usual American bottom bracket, but it's the Euro bottom bracket, so yeah.
These pedals were a thing of beauty, but also everyone's got a story about them. How many times do you pull them out of your shin?
Yeah, well, I think that scar there is courtesy of a set of Hutch pedals back in 1981. It's still there, so yeah. But these days, obviously, I don't. I'm a lot more sedate when I'm riding them. I mean, I ride this bike, you know, every weekend with my son. We're not out BMX racing, but without doubt, the hutches underneath your feet are solid. I know they're pretty gnarly looking with those spikes on it, but you know, you feel really planted and solid and very firm on it when you're riding. So yeah, I think for me they're definitely my personal choice of pedal, old school pedal. My favourite part of this bike, and the thing that took me a long time to get, and probably tested my wife's patience when it comes to the money I spend, was my original NOS JMC seat posts. You just don't see these things come up very often. And to be honest, I think they were a pretty ordinary seat post back in their day. They got bent quite easily. So there's not a lot of them around, but when I sort of was fortunate enough to come across that, I had to have it. So it was sort of, it's probably, of all of my BMX parts, it's definitely my favourite. And of course I'm a big fan of the Cashieros. So you can see a lot of my bikes, the red line's got the Cashiero, I've got the Cashiero on this. In fact, I was there the very day that Nicole Kidman made a visit to the Frankston BMX track, because they just released BMX Bandits, and she was at the Frankston BMX track to do a promotion for the movie, and Molly Meldrum was down there on the day doing an interview with Nicole. And of course, you know, Nicole was in her big, all of her BMX gear, but to her credit, she did a couple of laps around the BMX track, so yeah, it was an interesting day. Yeah.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure just to cast our minds back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we were just talking before. I think, you know, the thing that strikes me these days is just, I'm not suggesting it's good, bad, or indifferent, but just how much the BMX tracks have changed so much these days. And I think back to the track that I used to race in Victoria. You know, they were just big mounds of dirt, and you had to do some serious pedalling. And these days I see the young kids, and you know, it's all about the pumping, right? They're out of the gate, a couple of pedals, and then the rest of it's just pumping. So it's just a very different style of BMX racing. I mean, obviously, I've got my son Harry, who's 6, who is pretty keen to get into racing. I think we can give him a go next year, but it's going to be a very different experience for him than I certainly had growing up in Frankston, at Frankston BMX track.
All right, I reckon this is a series that could be continued.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it's always good to talk about BMX. So.
The 80s allowed people to discover cycling.
Certainly, I mean, it was great growing up in that sort of the late 70s, early 80s, being part of that, the infancy of the BMX scene. And I think, you know, I mean, I think it's obviously opened up that whole experience about more the adventure riding, right? You know, seeing the whole mountain bike scene open up now, which is, you know, obviously a massive scene these days. So yeah, I mean, I think BMX, and it probably still today has a huge influence on cycling as a whole.
Well, thanks for having a chat.
Yeah, no, it's been good. It's been good. Thank you.
It's a piece of art, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great.
Amazing.